Good morning. Some months ago I was invited on a pilgrimage for peace, and it focused particularly in the Palestinian-Israeli complex conflicts, a place where there's persecution and suffering, a place where there is killing and bombs and homelessness and refugee camps and numerous stories of pain. We gathered in a church, Uniting Church on the Upper North Shore, where we heard stories from the Indigenous people of Australia who understand what it's like to lose land and culture and be kicked off land, who spoke in solidarity. We heard stories of the suffering of people who have lost homes and lives, the killing, the bombs and the missiles and the guns, the fighting, the reactive fighting. We heard of people being refugees, and we heard from refugees who have escaped there and come here to find peace and a new life. We heard stories of their families back home, or from workers who had worked there to try and observe and keep peace. We heard through tears and mourning the stories of people. And then we walked down across the harbour bridge through the city to a park just below St Mary's, where we heard some more stories of hope and life. And on this day there were prayers from Christian, Muslim and Jewish people, all offering prayers of what could be, the yearning for peace, a ceasefire, a resolution, a way forward together. Through this day, as I walked, this prayer walk, if you like, praying for peace in the walking, in the listening to the stories and the people and their experiences, I was caught between the world as it is, the stories I heard of people's lives as they are now, with all the violence and the suffering and the pain, and the world as it can and should be. A world where people flourish together and there's peace, where we work together for a common good. And as I walked, I walked and stood in this space between the what is and what could be. It's a space that the Quaker educator, teacher and writer Parker Palmer calls the tragic gap. And he says that we should stay within this difficult space called the tragic gap. It's the space between the world as we know it, the world we experience on a day-to-day basis, particularly with its violence and suffering, and the world we know could be, the world we yearn for, the world that's possible. And he says it's important to try and maintain that space, that tragic gap, stay within it, rather than descending to one pole or the other. He says one way leads us into corrosive cynicism, despair, which can become anger and more violence, retaliatory violence. And we see that in our world. People whose lives just become so desperate and despairing and angry and corrosive, cynically corrosive, that they attack and are violent. But the other pole is equally dangerous. It's a utopian hopelessness. It's another world. It's a dream of idealism that could never possibly be or doesn't affect the here and the now. It's often a world, the world of heaven beyond death, life beyond death in this heavenly place where all is good and wonderful, but there is no impact on life now. And he says the tragic gap is this place between the world as it is and the world as it could be. And it takes courage and patience and waiting. It takes understanding and compassion. And in this space, it opens us up to compassion and love, to a way of non-violence, and to solutions that are bigger and beyond the simplistic notions and solutions and ideas that come if we follow one path or the other. It's a way that's different. It's a way that people like Martin Luther King Jr. walked, or Gandhi, or Dorothy Day, or Mother Teresa, many others. This way that holds the vision of what can be in the world as it is, and lives and works to bring them together, to bring this vision to life in the world now. And it's a hard and it's a courageous way, but it's the way of hope. And we've seen it in our world in so many spaces. And it's the way that Jesus walked. In all the stories that I read and hear of Jesus, he walks in this way between the world that he knows, the world he lives in, and the world as it can be, that he calls the reign of God. This vision of peace for all people, a place where all people can belong, a place where the lowly are lifted up and the high and the mighty and the wealthy and the powerful are brought down, and there's equality and sharing and generosity, where there's not an abundance and hoarding for the few and a lack in the rest. It's where all people share, and where we don't descend into violence and conflict and hatred and judgment. But we come to the table and share our stories and listen and talk and learn from one another and share with each other. And we grow into a deeper peace and life together. And it's demonstrated none more so in this week's story from Luke. It's the story, it's his version of the more well-known version in Matthew we call the Sermon on the Mount, with its Beatitudes. Here in Luke's Gospel, there are 4 blessings and 4 curses. Blessed are you who are poor. And that takes us right back to the first words of this adult Jesus in Luke's story, where he stands up in the synagogue in Nazareth and he takes a scroll of Isaiah and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, release of captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and freedom for the oppressed." Good news to the poor, and here it is. Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you who are hungry, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who mourn and weep and grieve, for you will laugh. You'll laugh and dance and sing. Blessed are you who are persecuted, because that's what they did to my prophets. And they were blessed and walked in the way of God. But then there's woes. Woe to you who are rich. You've received your reward in full. That's it. Blessed are you, woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who laugh and dance, for you will grieve and mourn. And woe to you who don't heed the words of the prophets. It's easy to look into this and say, yeah, Jesus, blessed are the poor, but it's 2,000 years later and they're still poor. They're still hungry. They're still mourning and crying. And the rich seem to be happy in their lot. But I think for Jesus, this is a walking between what can be and what is. The world that he lived in was a world where 95% of the people lived in impoverished circumstances. Not just economic poverty, but the poverty of rejection, of exclusion, of isolation, of being pushed away from the religious life and the life of the community because of illness, chronic illness or mental illness or disability or whatever it was, or their lack of education, or because they were women or children. And it's the same in our world today. The impoverishment of people is not just economic, it's a significant impoverishment in our world. People who don't have enough money to buy food or shelter or clothing or education or sanitation, all the things we take for granted. People who don't have enough food to eat. That's a significant impoverishment. But so is the impoverishment that other people feel because of mental illness or physical illness or disability of mind and spirit and being and body, and the resultant exclusion from the ways of life that most of us engage in. Or the judgment and exclusion because of gender or age or race or skin colour or language or belief system or faith or politics or sexual identity or sexual orientation, as we're seeing in the US at the moment. These things impoverish people, hold them captive. And Jesus says that's the world in which we live. And when you can't see it, when you can't see those who are hungry, those who mourn and grieve life, whether it's the life they live because it's so painful, or the grief of death or suffering. When you can't see the hungry, when you can't see those who are persecuted, and you won't respond, woe to you. Because you won't experience life in its fullness, because you'll shut yourself off and you'll isolate yourself in your wealth and your power. And yes, you might bring abuse and you may live in luxury and comfort, but you won't be living life to the full. Because the true life we all yearn for is life together, is life where there is enough for everyone and we can flourish. It's not in the continuous drive to accumulate more and more, to be rich and powerful and all the rest. That just brings more stress and more strain and more expectation. It's to stop and to live, to sing songs together, to laugh and play and eat and share stories and have fun in life, to share in the work and the load of work, to share with one another in our grief. It's when we reach out to those who are crying and mourning and grieving. It's to walk with them, to share their pain. It's to stand with them and listen to their story. And it's to embrace them into our life. And when we embrace the marginalised and the lonely and the outcast into this community of grace, instead of shunning them in fear or judgment, opening the world up through compassion and love, and hearing their voice, their stories, their wisdom, our world becomes broader, more colourful, brighter, deeper, richer. And there's life for all people. Instead of the continual conflict and being aware of the conflicting situations in our lives, of those who are enemies and working out who's friends and who's enemies and defending ourselves and guarding ourselves. That's not freedom. That's not life. It's a way of being together and of being able to trust each other and live in hope together. That's the dream of God. That's the world as it can and should be. It's a world that Jesus proclaimed, invites us into. And he invites us to walk into this way, this tragic gap that sees the vision and embraces people into the vision that can be. And as people come in and as we own that vision, it starts to become a reality in our world. When we reach out and feed the hungry, they are filled. When we reach out and hold those who mourn and grieve, they begin to soften their pain and start to laugh and sing. When we reach out to the poor in any way and invite them in, their impoverishment is lessened, and they start to be rich in the grace and the love of God. That's our vision, that's our calling. Let's walk together into this way of peace and life and hope for our whole world.